Whether it's a hot time in Florida or a rainy night in Georgia,
looking for trouble?
It's the perfect time for the TCBCast, an unofficial Elvis fan podcast.
Oh, yes, sir. Good to see you go, folks. This Black Fix bring you the hottest thing in the country, real hot and blue, coming to WHBQ in Memphis, Tennessee.
With your hosts, Justin Gosman and Gurdip Ladar. The TCBcast is on the air.
Welcome to TCBcast, an unofficial Elvis Presley fan podcast. I am Justin Gosman, and today we have a special guest host, Ryan Droste. Am I pronouncing that right?
That is correct.
I was hoping so. I listened to an episode of your show just to make sure.
Nice.
Because I was hoping that you would pronounce it on there, and you did. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Ryan. Tell us a little bit about your show, your podcast, what else you do, some of the writing you do, and fill our audience in.
Yeah, no problem. Well, first of all, I'm a huge fan of this podcast. So when I was listening to your episode last week and you mentioned Gurdip was going to be on the road, I was like, well, maybe I should reach out and see if you need someone to co-host. And to my luck, you did. So, yeah, like I said, Ryan Droste, and I am a lifelong Elvis Presley fan. Very similar in age to you guys, kind of a second generation fan. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I am a secondary history teacher, United States history, and part-time, as you mentioned. I do a lot of writing. I write for CBS Interactive over at popculture.com and comicbook.com, mostly covering the pro wrestling industry, which I hear Gurdip is a fan. So
Major fan. He's going to be jealous.
Maybe he'll check out some of my writing. But along those lines, I also host a podcast, which is kind of why I reached out. Got a little experience doing this, so I thought it'd be fun. That show is centered around the wrestling industry. It's called TopRopeNation, and so our whole archive's at TopRopeNation.com. And we're on all the podcasting websites that TCBcast is, iTunes, Stitcher, wherever. So YouTube, you can always check that out. But no, big time Elvis collector. Love listening to the show. And, I just thought when you guys launched the show, there's really nothing in the marketplace like this. And I just wanted to say I really, really look forward to listening to you guys every week. I think you got a good thing going, and I'm really excited to be here.
Well, thank you. I definitely appreciate that. I know Gurdip does as well. That was kind of our thing, was that it came out of Gurdip had actually posted on Reddit originally, hey, does anybody know if there are any podcasts? And I responded and I said, no, but I've been thinking about doing one. And he responded back going, do you want to try it? And that was that. I mean, we literally had one phone conversation just to feel each other out. And then we did it at the beginning of this year. So that was kind of the thing, was that there wasn't any others out there that had kind of the same coverage, I guess, because Graceland does the Graceland podcast, which of course focuses more on kind of what's going on down there in Memphis with Graceland and their kind of major expansions over the last few years, and then they do have some episodes talking about like the movies and so on, but it's very limited in scope. The episodes usually run about 15 minutes, and then there's another show that I found that's called The Jungle Room, and that's another one where it's good, but again, very short in scope. It's like 15-20 minutes tops. Some people would argue that our shows don't have to go as long as they do. Sometimes we get off track, but just to do a deep dive into the music and the movies and stuff is something that I like doing, and I know Gurdip likes doing as well. It's nice to have an outlet for that. In fact, we're recording this later in the week than I usually would with Gurdip, and I was actually kind of itching a couple nights ago, and I was like, okay, I should be talking about Elvis now. I got things I want to say.
No, I love it. I like the longer podcast personally. Just there's a few of them I subscribe to on topics I'm interested in. I like the deep dive format, and I think you guys do a really good job with it. So
thank you. Well, so tell me your background as far as when you discovered Elvis. When was that? You said you're a longtime collector and fan. Like how far back does that long time go?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because I assumed you were going to ask me that, and I was thinking, could I remember the first Elvis song I heard? And I really can't because, like you guys, I'm a second generation fan. I'm 34 years old. And The earliest things I remember watching, we had like the Great Performances VHS tapes, that set that I think EP put out, some of his best live performances. My dad had a VHS tape of the '68 special that he taped off of like HBO or something that I watched countless times growing up. And then like, my dad had a lot of the records, and both my mom and dad are fans. I think my dad was like the original that was like a really big fan of Elvis, and then he played him a lot around my mom, and then I was the first child. I was born. I just heard him like all the time in the background, and as a kid, I was just instantly hooked. We went to Graceland when I was very young. We were on the way to Florida for my aunt's wedding, and I think I was like 4 or 5 years. I think this was in 1988. I could be wrong. But we were there, and it was a really memorable trip because we were in Memphis, and they had a tornado there. And I don't think they're, a regular occurrence down there. But
No.
I very clearly remember being in the hotel, and like we had to go stand out in the hallway because there was a tornado coming through town, and it was like that really imprinted on my mind. So I remember the trip pretty clearly, but I remember going through Graceland, and it was a lot different than it is now. Like at the time, Aunt Delta was still living there.
Oh.
And I think even maybe Vester was still at the front gates. But because early on, when they first opened it, his aunt, was still living there, and
Right.
you didn't have the access that you do today. Like half the house was closed off, and
Right.
now that was a fun trip. And then I guess when I got in the mid '90s, when I was like junior high age, I still listened to Elvis like when he came on, but I kind of got away from him for a little while. And then when I got back in high school, I remember I had like a free CD to order. I think it was one of those old mail order CD companies.
Like something like the Columbia House record thing.
Yeah, and I just randomly picked out like an Elvis CD. Like I haven't gotten an Elvis tape or CD in a long time, and it was the number one hits, which was put out in the '80s, I think, originally. Not 31 number one hits, but like the number one hits. It was just 18 songs.
Yeah.
And I started listening to that a lot again, and it just kind of brought back a lot of memories from my childhood. And then I started kind of deep diving in the catalog again, and then this is when the internet was getting big, and then I found like the For Elvis CD Collectors Forum and started reading that all the time, and that kind of gets you deeper into it, and soon after that I'm getting the bootlegs and trading with people through the mail, and then found out about the FTD label, started buying those, and before long, I'm putting together all my Elvis CDs and DVDs, and it used to be just like a little shelf on my bookshelf, and pretty soon I had to buy a dedicated cabinet. So from that point on, that's when like the fandom hit the hardcore territory. And I guess since the early 2000s, I haven't really taken a break again. It's just been full on, really collecting as much Elvis as I can get my hands on, reading as many books as I can, and just all around really enjoy it, obviously. So
awesome. So collecting wise, I guess how big would you estimate your size is? Like how many CDs, vinyl, tapes?
Oh man, couple hundred maybe.
Nice, very nice.
I'm just starting to digitize everything, and there's actually been a really good post on the FECC forums about how do you organize your digital collection. So I've been reading that a lot and trying to come up with a formula for how I want to, rip all the CDs. And I guess the stimulus for that is I just moved houses, and it was just such a pain to move the collection.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm like, I really need to digitize, especially like all the bootlegs that I don't really need in jewel cases. So
right. Well, that's one thing that Gurdip had mentioned, was that a lot of his Elvis collection, his books and things like that, ended up not moving with him. When he moved out from his parents, and they're still at his parents, years and years later, just because and I think this is a generational thing where with, kind of us as millennials, we don't tend to hang on to a lot of those things. I think we're getting to where we like to downsize our, kind of impact on, our personal space.
Yeah.
So, what would you say was the collecting-wise again? What would be the hardest thing that you, like, well, what was the one that you went like the most out of the way to get? Like, was there a bootleg or was there an official album or something?
Oh, that's a good question. I think when I started, it was so hard to download anything, and I was getting everything through the mail and trades. And it's not really like hard to get now, but I remember at the time, like, I really wanted to get a hold of that Pittsburgh 1976 New Year's Eve show, and the video and the audio of that. And then now it's pretty widely available now, but at the time I was really pumped to get that. I guess the CBS special, which you guys mentioned, was it last week or a couple weeks ago, about the Reddit post? That was pretty cool. I mean, I had seen the Unchained Melody performance on that old VHS that I mentioned, the great performances, but I guess I had always wanted to see the full show just to see what it was. So I guess getting the VHS of that I got in a trade years ago. But I don't think I really have anything particularly rare in my collection, although when I got really hardcore into Elvis again in high school, I did find out an interesting family connection that I kind of had to the Elvis world.
Oh, how's that?
So my mom was a nurse. She's retired now. And she went to nursing school at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
Okay.
And she met a lot of celebrities up there when she was in nursing school. And one guy she met was a big-time Hollywood director. And she got to become very good friends with him. And this was George Sidney. And for those of you that don't know, he directed Viva Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think my mom ever knew that he had directed an Elvis movie until one time we were watching it, and the opening credits come out, George Sidney. I'm like, Mom, that's your friend. What the heck? And so he used to like write our family. We would get like Christmas cards from him and stuff growing up.
Wow.
But then they kind of fell out of contact. And I guess my mom had written him a letter when I graduated from high school, mentioning that her son had become such a big Elvis fan. And if he had any stories to tell or anything, it would mean a lot to him to hear from it, or like an old script or anything like that. But then she found out he had just passed away. But she did give me several of the letters that he had written her over the years. So I do have that like in my little Elvis cabinet.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Sounds like he was a pretty cool guy. I never met him, but my mom tells this story about she went to Europe when she was in college, and she went there with her mom, and Mr. Sidney, as she always calls him, like insisted on paying for like half of her trip to Europe. And she was like, I can't accept that. And he insisted. And so I guess he was a pretty generous, nice guy. So yeah, director of one of Elvis's biggest movies. That's a pretty cool connection.
That's fantastic. Well, and he also had directed Anne Margaret in Bye Bye Birdie, which was a spoof, obviously, on the Elvis phenomenon back in, there was a stage show in, I want to say, like 59 or 60, and then it was a movie in 63, the year before Viva Las Vegas. Wow, what a very cool connection.
Yeah, that's the one she would always mention. And I'd always ask her growing up, tell me the stories about all these celebrities you met up there at Mayo, and she'd mentioned Mr. Sidney and that he had directed Bye Bye Birdie, but she didn't know Viva Las Vegas. I guess he didn't talk about it much. But
yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So I guess that going back to one of the other things that you had brought up was trading, and as far as the collector kind of subculture, that's one thing that I think a lot of younger fans who are coming in and have this luxury of being able to have everything immediately accessible as far as Elvis's discography. That's one part of the subculture that I think isn't as well documented as it could or should be, because that was a huge part of the fan culture of not only, you were obviously on the tail end of it in the early 2000s, but going back into the very late 70s and all throughout the 80s, that was a huge part of fan culture and helped kind of not only with the bootlegs, which we covered way back on our bootleg and FTD episode, as far as showing that there was a market for alternate takes, alternate versions, more thoughtful compilations. But that's definitely an interesting thing. Did you ever do like any mail order things as far as collecting Elvis records? I know that there were some fan club groups that had like mail order things that you could do, or was that a little before your time?
Yeah, that was a little before. I got hooked up with like an underground, I guess they would call him dealer, which still exists, but there was a guy up in Canada that I used to get a lot of the bootlegs, and then later the FTDs through, and he would send out the updated inventory list on email every month,
nice.
which I always kind of looked forward to seeing what was coming out and everything. But that's probably the only thing along those lines.
Oh, okay. Cool. So what would you say would be, and you have to know this question was coming, but what would you say is your favorite Elvis album?
Probably, I listened to the 68 to 70 period the most. And if we're talking studio, probably from Elvis in Memphis, I would say.
My man!
Yeah.
My man!
Yeah, I listened to a lot of the 68 special material though quite often, but I think that session is my favorite by far.
Baby, you're wearing that love, don't look, shoot. Baby, you're wearing that love, don't look.
Yeah, definitely for me it's the American Sound Sessions from 1969. Gurdip has mentioned several times his kind of favorite period is the kind of 1958 to 1961 period, where it's more in the traditional rock and roll, but it's a little more polished. And that's the interesting thing too, is that there's so much. Elvis's career is so broad that it can cover a variety of different tastes. Because I know that there are some fans who don't, refuse to listen to, the 70s, but adore the early 50s stuff, stuff from Sun and 56 and 57. So you mentioned the Pittsburgh 76 show. Do you collect the concerts, or are you into soundboards, or is there like a certain line of like quality-wise that it has to be like audience recordings versus soundboards, or...
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm a huge... I have quite a few of them, but over the years, it's just kind of like I don't listen to enough of the concerts to continue getting them. Like if there's a particularly rare or notable concert that FTD puts out, I'll usually pick it up. But I think when I first was getting into the collecting world, I was trying to get as many concerts as I could, mostly the soundboards. Being from Iowa here, I would always seek out his 70s shows that there was recordings of in Iowa, and those are... The quality is not the best on the ones that are out there. Like he played in Des Moines twice and Ames once, and I have those, but it's not the best quality. But yeah, I mean, you guys have talked about this on a past show too. They do get a little repetitive. The set lists are very similar, so I kind of got out from that, and now I've been getting more into the studio outtakes, I would say. But it kind of, I don't know. My mood changes. Like I go back and forth. Sometimes I want to get a lot of concerts. Other times just the studio. I think with digitizing everything and keeping tabs on like which take and which alternate takes do I have, that's been really getting me into the studio side.
Definitely.
So I'd say lately that's more what I've been into. And then a preview for what's to come later in the show. Researching my song of the week for this week got me really deep diving into the studio session. So.
Awesome. So I guess recently things that have been going on in the Elvis world, kind of what was your take on Where No One Stands Alone? What were your kind of thoughts on that? Yeah,
I'm not a huge fan of the remixing kind of, or just using the new band with his voice. I'm not usually a huge fan of that. I checked it out, and I did like this one quite a bit. Maybe even more than the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra ones that they put out in the past. I did like the duet that Lisa put out. I thought the video was pretty well done. And I realize they have to do things like that to keep Elvis out there and relevant to the newer generations, getting something that's actually kind of new in front of them. I do think YouTube, and like with the video with Lisa, that's an area that they could do more of to reach the newer audience. Because like you mentioned, the kids of today have so much access to anything. I mean, like, if you look for an Elvis concert on YouTube, like, you can find it almost for sure. It's all out there. And music is so easy to access now versus having to download it or trade through the mail, that I think if they can hook some fans on some of these YouTube videos that they're putting out with the newer material, or just remastering old stuff and putting it up on their channel, it could send some newer fans like down the rabbit hole, and they're seeking out whatever they can find on YouTube.
No, that's and that's exactly kind of what it was like for me when I kind of came into being an Elvis fan in the early 2000s as well. Was that I was lucky that I was in this kind of phase of growing up with the internet as it was becoming a much more global phenomenon, and you had these kind of niche fandoms that had fan sites, and when YouTube came around in 2004, 2005, people did start uploading rare Elvis videos, and back in that time you would get like single MP3s or whatever, usually in very awful quality, but of some of those songs that I had never heard, and that was such a great opportunity for me to explore his catalog, and very different from, I think, the way a lot of first generations fans explored Elvis, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems to be a trend of kind of us in the younger generations. It seems like we don't quite have the same biases, I guess, towards certain parts of Elvis's career. I think we kind of take it all as one. And yes, we can divide it out, based on the types of material that he was recording at each time, and how his, personal life was panning out. But by and large, we're not necessarily as structured in our ways of discovering Elvis's music, in part because of those type of compilations and remixes and things like that. Like, especially on those early 2000s compilations, they would throw stuff. They do a 50 songs, and then they do a 70 song, and then they do a 60 song, and it would just bounce back and forth. Whereas when he was alive, barring some Camden compilations, it was all pretty linear.
Yeah, thinking back to that early 2000s period too, and like I mentioned, that was kind of when I was getting back into the Elvis world and really deep diving on a lot of this rare material. That was like the perfect time to be getting back into Elvis, because he became kind of a big deal again around 2002 with 30 number one hits and
Lilo and Stitch.
Yep, Lilo and Stitch, and then the JXL remix, and it wasn't long after that they put out the 68 and Aloha DVD sets, and that was a really good time.
Yeah,
looking back, as for an Elvis fan.
Yeah, we forget that sometimes, because those DVDs, those deluxe sets, I mean, that was the first time that those had really come out in an official capacity in their original states, because each of the first discs of those sets, the Aloha and 68, had a recreation of, with the exception of, obviously they didn't have like the commercials, but it was essentially a recreation of the original, whereas throughout the years there had been different TV edits which had substituted other songs or had re-edited the order of things, and that was one kind of notable thing as far as the early 2000s, was that again, like you said, that prominence of Elvis getting kind of a little more of his dues after probably a decade and a half of kind of being stomped on a little bit.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I was actually working at a Best Buy when all that came out, and I remember I was so excited. I saw, like, we would get the DVDs, a week before they actually hit the shelves or whatever, and I was searching through the boxes in the back looking for that 68 special set and the Aloha set, and just to hold it in my hands a week before it came out. I wanted to take it home so bad, but they would not allow us to buy stuff early. But I remember just like every shift going back there, just looking at the boxes, and the day it came out, I wasn't scheduled to work, and I think it was in the summertime, or college had just gotten out. And I went out there like right when we opened, and I remember that came out, the 68 set, the Aloha set, and Elvis at Sun, like on the same day. And I bought all three, and I remember some of my coworkers were like, we didn't realize you were such an Elvis nut. I'm buying like every new release that day. And nice. I always made a point when, back then people were actually still buying CDs, and every shift we had rows and rows of Elvis CDs, and I would always go over there this is gonna sound kind of goofy, but I would always put what I thought were his best albums like facing the front. Make sure
my
they're at the
gosh.
front of every stack.
No kidding. I do the same thing, or I used to do the same thing at like retail stores. I didn't even work at the stores, but I would just be browsing through, and if it was the Elvis section, I would pull like the one that I thought was like the most appealing out in front.
Yep, exactly. Same thing. And I would always just kind of like stalk that section when I was working to see if there was anyone like looking at the Elvis CDs, so I could have an excuse to go over there and start up a conversation and see what they liked. And it would happen once in a while. I remember one time I was working, a guy came in wearing like the red Elvis on Tour jacket that they had in the 70s. They had put out like sometime in the early 2000s or 90s, you could buy like a replica of that through EPE, and some guy came in wearing it. I could not believe my eyes.
Huh. Yeah, I've had some interesting conversations kind of out in the wild with some folks, especially not so much recently, but when I was, back when I was first becoming a fan, back when I was, 12, 14, 15, you'd go into, like, I would go to antique stores and look for LPs, and you'd get, some odd looks from some of the people that were running these antique shops, because they would usually be older folks, and they'd be like, aren't you a little young to be an Elvis fan? Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, not really, because it's still, I mean, it's relevant today. I mean, the music is still, it holds up, surprisingly well. There's very little of Elvis's catalog that doesn't hold up, as far as music. Let's see, what other kind of topics did I have for you? Elvis movies. What have you seen all of his movies? Do you have a favorite?
I have seen them all, and when I got my wife kind of into Elvis a few years ago, we went back and we started. She wanted to see all the movies. We went to Memphis. I took her to Graceland, and after that trip, she really wanted to see all of his movies. So that summer, we kind of started the hike of going through the DVD collection or Blu-rays, whatever I had them on, and watching all the movies. We still actually have not gotten through all of them, because when we kind of hit that mid-'60s period, she wasn't as excited to watch them, I don't think. But the early ones are, very good. I think King Creole is my favorite, like a lot of people's, that and Jailhouse Rock. But I am kind of partial to some of the later ones, too. I mentioned earlier how I got into Elvis with some of the stuff we had taped on VHS tapes as a kid. And we didn't have many of his movies, but one we had taped was Change of Habit. And I really liked that movie. It's actually, it's a lot different than what he was doing at the time than it's his last movie, but it's just kind of like a looser Elvis, I feel like, in that film. And it's cool that Mary Tyler Moore was in it. It's got a pretty decent soundtrack. So.
Yeah, Change of Habit is definitely far and away my favorite of Elvis's films. And I know that it's taken some hits review-wise by critics, kind of, even those reassessing it, in more recent times, just saying, the social commentary type stuff is very clunky, dated, some things don't hold up well. But you have to look at it from the context of when it came out, not comparing it to today. And at the time, I think the only reason that it didn't succeed was because Elvis's career had gone the way it had. I think if that movie had been released at an earlier point in his career, or if there hadn't been that kind of string of really kind of awful beach movies in the middle, I think it would have been much better received even at the time, because it was attempting to make very timely statements, as far as, kind of social commentary. Even if, by today's standards, it's a little clunkier. Back then, you just, aside from, people, it's kind of like today. People go to the movies, they want to escape. They want to go see superheroes. They don't want political commentary. They don't want to be faced, and especially in a year like 1969, where so much was happening. It was interesting when you look at Elvis's career that there was so little. And this is one thing that I think we were going to bring up, was your paper that you did, but that there had been. Kind of Elvis had become kind of the straight man, as far as the way that he was presented in the entertainment industry. He was kind of the, ironically, the representation of kind of mainstream culture.
Right.
And then for him to come back in 68, 69 with this more politically contemporary material that spoke to what people were feeling and thinking at the time, stuff like If I Can Dream, a film like Change of Habit, later on, Walk a Mile in My Shoes, in the ghetto. In the ghetto, yeah. And so let's go ahead and talk about that, because you mentioned to me, and this I thought was really interesting, your social sciences MA thesis was on Elvis and rock and roll performers as civil rights icons, kind of unrecognized or inadvertent. But what kind of is your take on that? Go ahead and explain for the audience. I took a read through it; it was very interesting.
Yeah, so I was going through doing my social sciences master's a couple years ago, and we had to pick out a topic. It could be anything we wanted to write about, history related, and I had remembered about 10 years earlier I'd done some research on Elvis. It was kind of my intro to history class when I first decided I wanted to become a history major, and that made me think of something else quick, too. I'm just going on a tangent for just 1 second.
Yeah.
But before I was a history major in college at University of Northern Iowa, I was majoring in electronic media, and this is going to be a connection to your show because someone you've had on the show before is also from Iowa. And when I was majoring in electronic media, I was doing a lot with like video production, kind of your line of work, actually.
Yeah.
And I had gotten in contact through the For Elvis CD Collectors Forum with Jamie Aaron Kelly. And because he's from Iowa, and he was doing a lot of tribute shows at the time.
Yeah, he's from Boone.
Yeah. So I'd contacted him, and I was actually talking to him about coming out and like filming some of his shows for him and then mixing them, because I had access to all that at the college, Adobe Premiere and everything. And then I changed majors, so that never happened. And then I kind of fell out of contact. I don't think I've talked with him since. So if he's listening to this, hey,
what a
Jamie,
small
what's
world.
up? Yeah, but I heard him on your show, and I remember that was a long time ago, but that was probably 13, 14 years ago. But then I switched to history, and then I did this original paper on Elvis and kind of exploring him as a civil rights icon, which he's not really thought of as such. And then so when I got back to doing this master's paper, I was like, man, I should deep dive back into that again. And I just kind of felt like 1950s rock and roll, and I've taught it this way in my high school classes before. I always make a point to teach rock and roll, and whenever I can, I feel like with my students, if I can relate history to pop culture, it makes it a lot more interesting for them.
I totally had that scribbled down as I was going to ask you about, with you being a history teacher, how early rock and roll and Elvis is kind of presented in current curriculum, or if you include that in any way.
Yeah, so when I was teaching high school, I would teach the 50s and the 60s, and now I don't get to teach that time period any longer. I do like the 20s and the 30s, but I always mention in the 20s how jazz and then later blues was kind of a blending of white and black culture, and civil rights and how that all kind of got brought out. And then when I got to the 50s, when I would teach that, I would always mention the black artists and how this was a predominantly black music style that white artists then got into and kind of brought this black culture to the suburbs, really. And the way I looked at it in my paper, and what I was trying to say, was that the black artists and the white artists in many ways were advancing the civil rights movement because they were blending what was considered pop and music, and also just in style and the clothes that they were wearing, to the suburbs in areas where white kids were growing up, maybe not knowing any black kids.
Right.
And to me, that's always been kind of a fascinating angle on that, because you don't think of Elvis as like the civil rights movement, but in many ways, he brought black culture to the suburbs, and other artists too, not just Elvis, but brought that culture to kids that never really felt black culture before. And I'm not saying Elvis did the kind of good for the civil rights movement that someone like a Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks did, obviously. And like the bus boycott, that's what everyone thinks of as kind of like the Big Bang in the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s. And while people around the country all heard about that, that didn't really personally touch them in the way that rock music did.
Also, the Brown v. Board of Education in the 50s. That was another kind of milestone in the lead up to kind of the major. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, yeah, you're right. Yeah, and in my paper I kind of brought that up as how Elvis going to Sun Studios was right after Brown v. Board, and it all kind of ties together. But yeah, I just feel like they brought the African American culture to the white areas of the country and kind of made that relevant to them, and then they felt this blending of the races that maybe they read in the newspaper about the bus boycott, but they weren't touched by that personally, maybe unless they lived in the South. But everywhere around the country felt the rock and roll revolution, and what happened there, where you had different races going to concerts together, and it was about the music, and they didn't really care about the racial issues when they were there.
Well, isn't that kind of a parallel today, where you have a lot of folks who, and you and I can both speak to this, living kind of in the Midwest, you have folks who aren't as in diverse of areas, not only racially, but also just, as far as gender and as far as, other, even just political party, just purely, political party. And a lot of that kind of seems like it's happening somewhere else, and you never really think about, or not you, but people seem to always think of that as a happening somewhere else, and then what you see happening is, when things do start coming closer and closer to home, you start getting pushback, which is kind of what happened, politically over the last few years, is that you've seen this kind of pushback against kind of what people have said, as far as political correctness, as far as, accepting people with different gender identities. And what's been interesting is watching how pop culture has been reflecting the social movements, and how it's been opening doors for people to understand better where other people are coming from. Because when you don't know somebody who's gone through that, it's difficult to empathize with them. But art has a way of allowing you to kind of see through somebody else's eyes. Is kind of what I think, and it's just been interesting watching, here the last few years, and I think that's a way for people today to look back and compare, kind of what was happening then to what's happening now. Is that Elvis came in and was, and that's what I think was interesting about your point, was that Elvis wasn't necessarily, out protesting on the streets, but what he was doing was an action, inadvertently almost, reflection of kind of the social integration of black and white culture that was happening to him on a personal level, but putting it in such a way that other people could relate to it, that young people could relate to it, because he was just doing what came natural to him, which was, he grew up, in Tupelo, in one of the poorest neighborhoods, basically in an African American community, and then in Memphis, was also, poverty-stricken as well, and he was just doing what came natural to him, but he was, bringing that music in such a way where it wasn't, kind of the way people put it as, like stealing the material, or, he was just being himself, and what he was just happened to be a reflection of where he came from and what it was there, thereby bringing, the type of movements that were happening in Memphis, because obviously, like, Martin Luther King Jr. was big in the South, and in Memphis, and obviously he died in Memphis, and throughout Elvis's career, that reflection of what was happening in the South was being pushed out through Elvis's music, even if in the 60s there was a little bit of a lull there where he was in Hollywood. And that's one thing I've said, I don't know if I've said it on the show, but I've said it to Gurdip, is that I kind of feel like Elvis has always been the underdog, even when he was on top, because when he came out in the 50s, he was, derided as, bringing the, and you were quoting one of the critics of Elvis, maybe it was in your paper, maybe it was somewhere else I had seen, but somebody had mentioned, like, mongrel music.
Oh, yeah, that was in the paper, yeah.
and very demeaning to African American culture, and they basically were, you had these preachers and community leaders that were terrified of, what Elvis's music would bring, and so he was pushed down. Well, then when he came back in the 60s and he became this kind of Hollywood megastar, ironically, he flipped where, the Beatles were suddenly on top and all of these much more progressive, folk artists were suddenly becoming, the counterculture was kind of on top. And so Elvis, kind of representing the mainstream, got pushed down. And then by the time he came back around to Las Vegas, then again he was being, put down while, rock and roll had moved beyond him, and he was going more towards a country, easy listening vein. And, people were very disappointed that he wasn't continuing to innovate in rock and roll. So for me, it's always seemed like Elvis was kind of an underdog even when he was on top. It was very bizarre. He had a very bizarre career in that way.
Mm-hmm. And then even in the 70s, he was still doing things that were I won't say outlandish, but he was still trying new things, and that were, kind of a mix of that white and black culture. Like when he went to Stax in '73, he mentioned that in the paper. Like even so, his music styles were changing, but he was still kind of right on that front edge of blending white and black music and styles and everything. So.
He's gonna walk beside us. Time is coming near. He's gonna wash away all our misery and our fear. I got a feeling in my body. This will be our lucky day. We'll be released from all our sorrow, leaving that alone away.
It's I mentioned that 60s period. I think at some point in my paper how, like you were saying, he'd kind of gotten away from the forefront, and I think when the Civil Rights Act was signed, he was filming Girl Happy or something. So at that point, he was he was pretty far away from being on the front edge of what was going with the cultural shift. But it always kind of came back around, like through his whole career, where he was one of those guys that he was right on the front lines. And I think one of the things that has bothered me the most is, as an Elvis fan, is like the false narrative that either Elvis was racist or that Elvis was stealing music. I think it's really ignorant to imply that like a race owns a style of music. I don't think anyone can own music. Like everything about the music industry is a blending of a lot of different styles, and everyone's influenced by people of all races and different types of singers. And Elvis was, like you had mentioned, kind of the perfect character to be on this front edge of rock and roll, because he wasn't stealing it. It was his culture. He was from Tupelo. He grew up on the black side of town. He wasn't stealing because that's what he grew up hearing. That was his music too. Yeah,
that's the other thing too. Is oftentimes you hear that the hypothetical of, oh well, if it and this is on the other side of it. Well, if it hadn't been Elvis, it would have been somebody else. And it's like, first off, well, the reality is that it was Elvis. But even at that, I don't think anybody else that kind of followed him would have had the same impact that Elvis did, because they weren't as genuine. Yes, you had, rockabilly, rock and roller, kind of country rock guys like Roy Orbison, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, who had certainly some African-American influence on their music, but it wasn't the same. They were far more country than they were R&B.
A little shoeshine boy, he never gets low down, but he's got the dirtiest job in town, bending low at the people's feet on a windy corner of a dirty street. Well, I asked him while he shined my shoes, how'd he keep from getting the blues? He grinned as he raised his little head, he popped his shoeshine rag, and then he said, get rhythm. When you get the blues, come on, get rhythm. When you get the blues.
And then on the other side, with guys like Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Ray Charles, they often leaned a little more blues and R&B.
You can talk about the pit, barbecue, the band was jumping, the people too. Mess around, they're doing the mess around, they're doing the mess around, everybody doing the mess around.
Then it's this very odd mix of, it's got to be the right 50-50 balance of both sides. And, you know, I wish that I could find, like, if there was another artist at the time who, you know, maybe Clyde McPhatter is comparable. But that, as far as, you know, background, as far as, you know, the musical style, as far as their influences.
Early in the morning, before the crack of dawn, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, why was I born? I'm so broken-hearted, I just can't go on since you've been gone.
And that's why I've kind of mentioned, you know, guys like Roy Hamilton and Clyde McPhatter and those pop influences, because I think a lot of people forget, you know, people like to focus on the R&B and the country influences on Elvis, but they forget about that there was a pop side as well. And also so early in his career that if you actually look at the context of his whole career, everything that he was doing in the 70s makes perfect sense if you don't leave out his pop stuff in the 50s, stuff like I Was the One and stuff like I Want You, I Need You, I Love You. So yeah, and it's just pervasive throughout his entire career that, like, obviously he was going to end up doing country and easy listening and what they kind of derisively call as like middle of the road type stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and we'll get into that in my song of the week. Do you have anything else that you want to talk about? I have a couple other questions, but is there anything kind of on the tip of your tongue that you kind of you know, think about Elvis that you feel is worth talking about? Or
not really. I was kind of browsing through my paper as you were talking on some of those racial topics and everything, and I had written, music does not belong solely to one race or type of people, it belongs to the masses, which I think was a good point that I had made in the paper. I wrote, to say that Presley stole a music style that belongs solely to African Americans not only marginalizes the contributions of other black performers in the explosion of rock and roll, but it also minimizes the impact that many white country and western and gospel singers had on the fusing of musical styles that resulted in this new emerging style of popular music in the 1950s. So, yeah, I think they're difficult questions to answer for sure, but I do think, and there continues to be, this kind of misunderstanding about Elvis's role in the 50s and really just how close he was to the black community. And I haven't seen it, but I know there's this new film out. Is it called The King or something like that,
yes,
where the guy goes around the country? Yep. And I've read some things on it, and I got to say I was pretty disappointed in some of the comments I read about it, because someone that I follow on Twitter and I usually make a point to read his writings is Van Jones. Yes. And
yeah, sorry,
that's all right.
Interrupting, but Van Jones I loved in the aftermath of the 2016 election, where he would go out to communities in the Midwest and he would have, you know, town halls. You know, he's one of those guys that reaches across the aisle, and he's very intelligent. So I'm a big fan of his as well, and I was disappointed to hear kind of what he had to say in that film.
Well, it just sounds like he's not very well educated on the topic, and he just kind of went off what the generalized interpretation of white artists in the 50s is. But it's like what you're saying about Elvis here, supposedly, because I haven't seen it, but you know, implying he's a thief and everything. It's like the one guy of the white men doing that style of music in the 50s, like Elvis is the least deserving of that criticism, I feel like.
Yeah, much more like a Pat Boone or.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you can just look at the contemporaries. You guys got into this on your coverage of The Searcher, but if you look at his contemporaries, it says it all, because he was very much respected by the African American artists of the 50s. You know, look at what James Brown said about Elvis when he passed away. You know, James Brown went out of his way to praise Elvis when he passed away, and I think I had some quotes in my paper from about what he thought about Elvis and, you know, how genuine he was to the community. And that bothers me a lot as a
and even like we've touched on, I think last episode we had kind of touched on, you know, guys like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, who were of his peers maybe the most critical of him. We're still going, no, he deserves our respect, but what needs to be focused on is the fact that, like, we're getting left out. You know, don't make it all about him. He was great, and he opened a lot of doors for us, but we also came through those doors. Like, we were right there with him. And that's where their criticism was coming from, and absolutely, rightfully so. One thing I was going to back up on, you had mentioned getting your wife into Elvis and going back through and watching the movies and listening to his music as well. Do you prefer or would you recommend watching and listening in order, or kind of out of order, kind of picking and choosing? Because that's when I met my girlfriend, I kind of eased her into my Elvis fandom because I didn't want to scare her away from it. So we didn't start with Love Me Tender and work our way forward. I actually started her with Change of Habit and then kind of poked around to some of the other good ones, and then we made some of the other not so good ones, that I could still poke fun at, stuff like Kissing Cousins and Harem Scarum, where they're still fun to watch. And then there are still some that I haven't watched with her because I'm like, unless we're going to do a review of it on the show, I don't want to watch this.
No, certainly. Yeah, real quick though, I did want to say too, on my paper, just so people don't get me wrong,
sorry.
the whole Masters paper though, just to bookend that topic, isn't so most of it does focus on Elvis because it was an Elvis research paper, but I did make a point to say he wasn't the only artist that I looked at as kind of a civil rights figure. I mentioned Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee too, but I think a lot of those guys just broke down the walls, and Elvis in particular letting the black artists walk through the door and burst through the door like they did, and have that opportunity when people like Ed Sullivan weren't going to have rock and roll people on his show. Yeah. So I think all of them across the races, they can all be looked at as civil rights icons. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and then as far as my wife goes, that's funny you mentioned that because I feel like Elvis isn't someone you have to watch in order or listen to in order. Just because his career is so different. Compare that with someone like Bruce Springsteen, who I'm also a massive fan of. When I got into Springsteen, I started at the beginning of the catalog and I listened to every album in order. And I think for him that's kind of important to do because a lot of his albums and the way he writes his songs deal with characters that he had in an earlier album. And Elvis is not like that. Like Elvis's career is so different, and the 70s is so different from the 50s. And I think that's a good thing, really, because I think one of the things people get wrong about Elvis, and his contemporaries even got wrong at the time, is that a lot of the criticism he got in the 70s from some people was like, oh, we wish he'd just go back and play the Sun material. Or I think John Lennon said something along those lines. The Beatles.
Elvis died when he went into the army.
Yeah, and it's just I feel like they just don't really get it because did you want Elvis to just be a greatest hit singer for his whole career?
Right.
He was trying to do fresh stuff. He was an evolving artist, and a lot of greatest hits acts today don't do that. They play the same songs from 30, 40 years ago all the time. Someone like Springsteen, he's still writing fresh material. And although Elvis didn't write, he was picking up new material and he was evolving his style. And I think
go ahead. Oh, sorry. Go ahead and finish your thought.
I was just going to say, I think that's why you don't really have to listen to it in order to understand him. I feel like you can jump around, and same with the movies too.
Yeah, and going back to kind of what you were saying as far as Elvis, being kind of a greatest hits artist, or the damning word at the time was an oldies artist. In the 70s, you had his contemporaries, and you look, who else was out there besides Elvis? Chuck Berry had been gone. Little Richard wasn't charting. Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't charting. Carl Perkins was nowhere to be found. Johnny Cash was the only one that was really having any success, and only in the field of country music. And Roy Orbison had some pop hits, but he was never a massive success anyway. He was always kind of a B-tier rock and roll performer. He was always extremely talented, and he had those great hits like Pretty Woman and You've Got It and Blue Bayou, and but he was never going to be top of the charts every album, every single. So you look at his contemporaries, and they had been pushed to the side just in the same way that Elvis did when the British invasion happened. It's not like if Chuck Berry was going to be, recognized for his, achievements in the 70s. Could you name, like, aside from, I could name one of Chuck Berry's singles in the 70s, and it's My Ding-a-Ling, which was a novelty. You know, Elvis was developing as an artist and continued to, and he kept with the times. And ironically, it goes back to that quote from Jailhouse Rock that Vince Everett had. It ended up being more potent the longer Elvis had his career going. It's the music changes every 6 months. You got to change with it. And he did. I mean, in the early 70s, he was closer musically to guys like Tom Jones and P.J. Proby and, what was the guy that did Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head? B.J. Thomas.
Yeah, yep.
And then, as the 70s progressed, he started picking up stuff from guys like Chris Christopherson, James Taylor, and as you got into the late 70s, gosh, what was he doing in the late 70s? That's the other thing. I want to do an episode, and I'll have to mention this to Gurdip. I want to do an episode on, like, Elvis's, like, quote-unquote original songs, the ones that originated with him. That to me has always been an interesting topic, like the songs that started, like, he's the first person that recorded it. Because there are so many of his songs that are covers or had been recorded before. But stuff like Way Down, had never been recorded before. And that was, again, him trying something new.
Ooh, and I can feel way down where the music plays, way down like a tidal wave, way down where the fireplace, way down.
And what were your thoughts on, I know we're running up before we get into the song of the week, but on Way Down in the Jungle Room, that set, and kind of the 76 sessions, because those kind of, 76 and 77 have taken a lot of beating for being more middle of the road, but I've always really enjoyed those recordings, and Way Down in the Jungle Room I appreciated because it showed that Elvis was still engaged in the recording sessions when he was there. Obviously, it was a struggle getting him in there, but when he was there, he was engaged.
Len, if you'd pay attention, you guys have been in the studio too long, so they're going, little 1, 2, 3, get loose, live, like we used to do on stage.
Yeah, we was all drunk then. We're
Oh,
not.
well, get drunk now, man. I'll get you damn bum. You want to where you at? Bring out the booze. Grandma?
Okay, he said loose. You guys heard that. Ours one. I wish you had heard that.
Bullshit. You can't get too loose for me, son.
No, when you asked me earlier about my favorite studio albums, I actually like those last two quite a bit, and I find it fascinating how he recorded at Graceland, and what a missed opportunity that they didn't film any of that. It'd just be so amazing if they had that. But
they didn't even really have any photos. I think there's like maybe 2 photos that exist.
Yeah, that's just mind blowing.
Yeah. Gosh.
That is one of the areas that the Colonel and his management were not on the forefront of, is just because there's not much, professional footage of him. No. And they really missed the boat there. But I like that because so much of the emotions of what he was feeling at the time comes out in the music that was selected around then. And I feel like his voice was still very good on those albums.
Yeah. And
when he was inspired.
The other thing too, that to touch on, the video and photos, there wasn't a whole lot of professional photos of Elvis off stage. I mean, that's why you had that awful glut of 70s releases where every single one of them was Elvis against a black background in a white jumpsuit, and you couldn't tell if it was going to be a Camden compilation of movie songs from the 60s, if it was going to be an album of new material, like brand spanking new material like Elvis Today, or if it was going to be kind of a hodgepodge compilation of 70s stuff like Elvis Now, or like love letters from Elvis. Like there was no way of telling what it was going to be. Like, wouldn't it have been great to have like from Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee in 76, have like the album cover be Elvis in his home recording Like,
oh man, yes.
like just
amazing.
It would have, without changing the track list, without changing anything else, just the sales pitch makes such a huge difference in how people perceive a product. People really do judge books by their cover. And it was so hard to, even when I was going through the albums on my YouTube review series where I went through all the 60 album box set, I was like, there's no excuse for this. These are really bad, because I held them all up and I was like, there's seriously 15 albums here that look exactly the same.
No, seriously, I think I just thought of this is, we've all, as second generation fans, we've had times where people kind of tease us about liking Elvis, or there's been periods of time where liking Elvis wasn't the coolest thing. I feel like he's more respected a little more as an artist in the last few years than maybe earlier in my life. But if I was buying an Elvis album and I was embarrassed, I wouldn't be embarrassed because I was buying an Elvis album. I'd be embarrassed by holding that cover up on some of those 70s records, because the covers are so terrible. Well,
and the covers were not that great for the rest of his career either.
That's true.
Stuff like Something for Everybody. No, not Something for Everybody. What was the one? Elvis for Everyone. God, and that's the other thing. The album titles were awful, too, because they didn't tell you anything. But Elvis for Everyone, where it's literally him standing behind a cash register with the lists of songs on either side of him. It says nothing about the material. There's no cohesion whatsoever. And it's just, even later, after, kind of the posthumous releases, there just wasn't a whole lot that stand out to me as far as great graphic design. More recently, there has been a few, like Elvis at Stax. That set was phenomenally designed. What was another one that was really good? Oh gosh, I'm trying to think. Boy from Tupelo was okay. It just had a picture of Elvis at 54. I did like the choice of photo for the Searcher. It was good branding. I understand where some people were criticizing it because of the eye color. And you mentioned the Searcher. Did you like the Searcher?
Oh yeah, loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I've watched it several times since it aired. I've been waiting for a documentary like that about Elvis for a long time. And like I said, I'm a big Springsteen fan, so I was very familiar with the director. And I thought they did an excellent job. I liked it a lot. Yeah,
ditto. So anyway, I think, let's see, we're running up on about an hour, so we should probably roll on the Song of the Week. But it's been great having some great discussions. I think it would be fun to have you back on when we have like an actual specific topic to touch on. I'm sure Gurdip would love to chat wrestling with you as well. I was going to ask you, what would be your take? Do you think Elvis would like pro wrestling?
So supposedly he was a pretty big pro wrestling fan. Here in Iowa, where I live in Waterloo, Cedar Falls, there is a wrestling museum, and it's here because it's where Dan Gable grew up, the famous amateur wrestler and coach. But they have a pro wrestling wing to that Hall of Fame, and there's actually a picture in there of Elvis with is it Sputnik Monroe? There's a picture of him. He's at a wrestling event, and then supposedly at the old auditorium, I think the Ellis Auditorium in Memphis, where they would have matches, they always reserved a seat for him, like up in the balcony where he could just show up wherever he wants, or whenever he wanted, and that once in a while he would go early in his career. And I think there's another picture of him with like a female wrestler that he was supposedly like linked to at one time. But I think he did like it. And Jerry the King Lawler, who's from Memphis, he wrote in his book that there was some talk in the 70s of doing some kind of storyline where they were going to bring Elvis in, kind of before like the whole Andy Kaufman thing happened, but to give like bring in a celebrity to the wrestling world. And he claims in his book he talked to Vernon about getting Elvis involved, and there would have been like some story about who's the real king of Memphis kind of thing. But I don't know if this is Jerry Lawler just playing this up and if it really happened or not. But he claims in his book that this was the case. I find it maybe a little hard to believe, but it's in there. So I do think that he did like it at one point. I know that for sure. And I was in New Orleans. I went to WrestleMania this year, And mentioning King Creole earlier is my favorite film of his. Me and my buddy that I went to New Orleans with were out on Bourbon Street one night, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And I was like, there's the intro in King Creole, the song Crawfish. My daughter loves that scene. We watch it over and over on YouTube, like before she goes to bed. And she loves the song. She loves the scene. And I'm like, the street they filmed for that scene is like just a couple blocks away. So we walked over there that night, and I saw I think it's on King Street, saw the building that Elvis lived in King Creole, and where that opening scene, they filmed the outer of it. And that was pretty cool because there was like nobody in the area at the time. Everyone was on Bourbon Street and just looking up at that address over there on King Street where Elvis, these scenes were filmed from King Creole. It was a pretty cool moment for me.
I went to the bayou just last night. There was no moon, but the stars were bright. Put a big long hook on a big long pole, and I pulled Mr. Crawfish out of his hole. Crawfish.
Yeah, no, I mean, when we did our film commentary, that was one thing that we talked about, just that it captured the vibe of New Orleans so well. Besides just, obviously the fact that it was shot on location, but just I love the cool factor of New Orleans in that film, and I think it still holds that kind of allure. Oh yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the big reasons I like, not just because the script is so good and he worked with such a good director, but just the fact of the on location shots that they filmed and everything. And it's such, if you've never been to New Orleans, like anyone listening, you got to get down there. It's such a cool city to visit. The architecture's amazing, and yeah. Nice. Well, shall we go ahead and roll into Song of the Week?
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Let's make it like the first chorus all the way through.
Since my baby left me, will I find a new place to dwell? Well, it's I got a gal that I love so.
We can go on together with suspicious minds.
I'm all shook up.
Well, that's different. That's a pop song now, Nilly.
So whenever we have a guest on, we always allow them to go ahead and go first. So go ahead, Ryan. Take her away.
Right. So my song of the week is Pocketful of Rainbows from the 1960 film G.I. Blues.
I don't worry whenever skies are gray above. Got a pocket full of rainbows, got a heart full of love.
Very nice.
Yeah, so there's a reason I chose this song. So my daughter, who is 2.5 years old, we've been playing her Elvis since she was, before she was born. We were playing Elvis to her when she was still in the womb. And but this particular song, for some reason, even now, just calms her down whenever she's upset. There's actually a video I have of her just completely losing it. She was only a few months old at the time, and I started up the song Pocketful of Rainbows, and like it flips a switch and she just gets instantly relaxed, stops crying. It's amazing. And even today, like when we put her to bed, if she is not having it, I'll put that song on the Alexa and it calms her down. And it's something about Elvis's voice. I've said this to my students before when I'm playing him in the background when they're working on assignments, but early 1960s Elvis, that voice is just so smooth and so amazing that it's really soothing for little kids, I think. And she's just, she loves this song. It's her favorite Elvis song. And I like it too. And it's, the soundtrack isn't the most dynamic soundtrack he had, but this song was pretty challenging for him to record, I think, just looking at the sessions.
Yeah.
So for those that don't know, this was written by Fred Wise and Ben Wiseman, who wrote many, many songs for Elvis. A lot of his movie music, some of them not limited to, but some of the songs were Follow That Dream, I Got Lucky, Wooden Heart, Rockahula Baby, As Long As I Have You. They also wrote Fame and Fortune outside of the movies. And Fred Wise passed away in 1966. He was only 50 years old at the time. But Ben Wiseman, in particular, he had a really long relationship with Elvis. And he actually had more of his songs recorded by Elvis than any other songwriter, 57 in total. Which is amazing. He also was involved in writing the song Change of Habit, First in Line, 20 Days and 20 Nights, many, many others. Elvis actually nicknamed Ben Wiseman the Mad Professor. And it was because I guess he didn't really look like a rock and roll writer, had a different appearance. So this was kind of like a coy nickname that Elvis had for him.
Did he have kind of a Doc Brown type look?
I think so, yeah. So... yeah, I guess for his career, Wiseman, he had more than 400 songs recorded, not just by Elvis, but in total, and 1,000 songs published. And I found that his songs have sold more than 100 million units. And I found an interview that Wiseman had done. He passed away in 2007. But he was talking about like the last time he saw Elvis, and it was in the 70s. He went to see him in Vegas. And so he wrote, quote, Elvis invited me to come up to one of those wild parties, the last evening of the season in crazy Vegas. And I went upstairs and Elvis grabbed me, stood me up in front of the crowd and announced, I want you all to meet Ben Wiseman, the man who has written more songs for me than any other writer, 57. I want to hear it for this man. And everyone clapped. And then Wiseman writes, there was a big applause. Then he took me over to the piano. It was just me and him. Elvis wasn't looking too good at the time. His eyes were puffy and he'd gotten very heavy. He said to me, Ben, there's a song I love called Softly As I Leave You. Indeed, I knew it well, one of those ballads that just about everyone had had a crack at in the 60s. After he sang his heart out, Elvis said, this is not a song about a man who's leaving his girlfriend. It's a song about a man who is going to die. And then he said, I didn't know what to say, but I knew there was trouble coming. As Elvis held my arm, I could feel his hand shaking. It made me feel as though mine was shaking too. And that was the last time I saw him. That was pretty powerful.
Oh, I'd never heard that story before. That's cool.
Yeah. So that's Ben Wiseman, who wrote Pocketful of Rainbows, a lot of other Elvis songs. And I mentioned earlier that Elvis had a little trouble recording this song. So he recorded at 2 different sessions. The first was a 2-day session. And I didn't know this, researching this, but there had been a new union arrangement made in the early part of 1960 between RCA and their recorders.
Okay.
And so this session, April 27th and 28th, 1960, was at RCA Studios on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood. And this was because RCA had made this agreement where everything that they might put out had to be recorded in their studios. And so Elvis didn't always record in RCA studios. And supposedly he was really uncomfortable that day from what I found. It said, well, first of all, he recorded Pocketful of Rainbows on the 28th, the second day. And let's see, I wrote, the Engineers Labor Union had required all RCA records to be recorded in RCA's own studios. So this would apply to all of Elvis's movie recordings, since they could be released by RCA at some point. But Paramount was in charge of this session, and apparently Elvis was really not a fan when he walked in of how the studio was set up, because it was a lot different than how he usually recorded. They had a 3-track machine there with positions of the microphones all over the place. And that was so that the recording would sound very clean, so it could match up with the audio in a scene in the movie, however they wanted to place it.
Right.
So they had 3 tracks, and he was not a fan of that. It made the recording sound kind of flat. So apparently he was really uneasy in the studio that day and felt out of his element, according to reports. He did 28 takes of Pocketful of Rainbows on that first day. They chose take 12 as the temporary master, but they weren't really happy with it.
Got a pocket full of rainbows, got a star up my sleeve. Kiss me extra tender, hold me extra tight, 'cause I'm saving your sweetness for a lonely night. No more tears.
So, like a week later, Elvis demanded that they have another session, and no matter what the agreement they made was about having to use an RCA studio, he was going to have this taking place at Radio Recorder Studio B in Hollywood.
Nice.
So they went there on May 6th, and apparently Elvis was a lot more at ease, and he recorded 3 takes of Pocketful of Rainbows that day, and take 2 was the master. And they also did an overdub recording with, who was it? Louis Jean Norman recorded for the movie scene, which was lip-synced in the movie by Juliette Prowse, the actress.
Got a pocket full of rainbows, got a star up my sleeve. Kiss me extra tender, hold me extra tight.
And it looks like at Studio B at Radio Recorders, it went a little more smoothly than RCA Studios on Sunset. So 3 takes versus the 28, where Elvis just wasn't feeling it the first time.
Right. Yeah, and it that's one thing that and maybe it was just the studio, but it seems like, and if you go listen to the outtakes on the 2 GI Blues FTDs, because there was GI Blues and there's Cafe Europa. There are a lot of those songs from those first sessions where they have just vastly different arrangements. But then also Elvis just seems to be struggling, even though they're complete takes. Vocally, they seem okay, but it just seems the vibe isn't what Elvis is wanting, and he kept trying to get it to where he wanted to get him to.
Kiss me extra tender, hold me extra tight, 'cause I'm saving your sweetness for a lonely night. Ooh.
Hell no. Hold it. Say whoa, Ace. Say whoa.
And then, obviously when they changed venues and went back, Elvis hit them and nailed them within, a handful of takes each. Obviously some of the takes are, like, for example, Tonight Is So Right for Love, there are a lot of false starts and things like that. But on Pocketful of Rainbows, like you said, 3 takes and bam, it was done the second time around. But there were a lot of complete takes as far as outtakes for Pocketful of Rainbows originally. He just didn't seem like he could get it. And my take on the original arrangement, I like that it's more upbeat. It's not a bad arrangement, but it just doesn't quite fit the scene in the movie. I really appreciate the use of it in the film. It's this very laid back kind of vibe. Yeah, definitely enjoy this one. Yeah, and that was in fact, I think I mentioned on one of our first episodes, one of the first Elvis records I ever owned was the GI Blues soundtrack. I inherited it from my grandpa, and he had Elvis's Golden Records and he had GI Blues, and he had actually gotten GI Blues. It still has the sticker on it where it had been on sale at it was like an on-base site because my grandpa was in the Air Force. And he bought it at one of the shops on base, and so it still has the little sale sticker from the store. And so along with the rest of the GI Blues soundtrack, this is one of the first songs really that I had heard from Elvis that when I became a fan and had like a record to just listen to over and over and over and over. So yeah, great pick.
No, I think the song is interesting because it is kind of a vocally demanding song. You see that kind of softer melodic voice that he had after he exited the army, and
it's deceptively difficult. Like it seems like it's a very simple melody and a simple song, but it vocally takes him all over the place.
Oh yeah,
because it takes him up into his head voice, and then he drops down into his baritone. He's just all over the place.
Yeah,
in a good way.
For a lonely night.
Let's take it again. Let's take it again real quick.
Your sweetness for a lonely night. Aye. For a lonely night.
Oh, not a crack. Let's start again, kind of Schnell like. Ooh.
Want to play back?
I don't worry when it.
Oh, hell, man. Hold it. I got all kinds of fraud.
Mr. Hardy.
Hey, did I or did I? Did I? Oh, man, hell. My throat's had it, child. It's had it, no kidding. I've tried so hard, so hard to please.
Why don't you sing I'm Doing the Best I Can?
I'm doing. I'll tell you what, let's try it one more time, and if I crack, well,
If you crack, you got a new world's record. It's 29.
I did 60 one time.
69, I think it was.
And the record never came out.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if you look at like the Elvis at his back sessions versus this, the material for GI Blues was nowhere near as good, but there was still some demanding stuff like this song. So I don't know, maybe he was a little frustrated too because the quality of what he was recording had gone down a little bit, just for the movie soundtrack. But I think this is one that he gave his best at, and he knew it was going to require a little something extra, and it frustrated him for sure. And I found there's some other artists that have recorded it, and it kind of shows that it is a demanding song because of the other versions I found. I didn't really care for many of them.
Which were some of the ones that were notable?
Yeah, so the first one I found was the demo that was supposedly sent to Elvis, and this was from Jimmy Breedlove, who he later had a brief stint in an R&B group called the Ravens, which was an early R&B group from like the 40s and 50s, but he had joined the group in like the 70s, so this was before that. But kind of an R&B singer, did a lot of demo recordings, and that version is actually pretty darn good, I would say.
I don't worry whenever skies are gray above. Got a pocket full of rainbows. Got a heart full of
Jan and Dean recorded Pocketful of Rainbows. It was on a they recorded it in 1966 that wasn't released until 1996, and I could understand why after listening to it, because it's not a very good version. It definitely doesn't have the vocal range that Elvis had on their version.
Mr. Heartache, I found a way to make him live. I got a pocket full of rainbows and a star up my sleeve.
There is a Australian singer, Colin Cook, that recorded it. The arrangement on this one is different. Those first two I mentioned, the arrangement's pretty much the same in the background. This one has a different arrangement. There's background singers on it. Kind of a fresher take on the song. That one wasn't too bad.
Kiss me extra tender, hold me extra tight, 'cause I'm saving your sweetness for a lonely night. No.
And then this was kind of funny. In 1993, there was like a Japanese techno pop group called YMO that recorded it. And it's in Japanese, so I couldn't understand the lyrics, but you can hear like it sounds like the song. You can tell they're singing Pocketful of Rainbows. So the arrangement's pretty interesting because it's techno, but you can hear the tone in the vocals is similar. then lastly, a guy named Ray Kondo, a Canadian country singer, recorded it in '97, and that version is a little twangier, a little more country, a little bit different arrangement. He imitates Elvis's voice a little bit. You can tell he's trying to pattern his vocals after Elvis's original vocals, and that one's not too bad either.
Kiss me extra tender, hold me extra tight, 'cause I'm saving your sweetness for a lonely night. No more tears.
I'd say of all of those, probably the Colin Cook version of the officially released ones is my favorite, the Australian singer.
Yeah.
But the Jimmy Breedlove demo, I'd say altogether is the best of the other singers that did it. But no, and of course the song was also on the soundtrack for Jerry Maguire, Elvis's version too, which I wanted to point out as well.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Very cool. Well, great pick.
Thank you. First crack at it. I didn't want to disappoint you, Justin.
No, it was great. All right. Well, mine was it's interesting. From 1972, I picked "Fool."
Fool, you didn't have to hurt her. Fool, you didn't have to lose her. Fool, you only had to love her. But now her love is gone.
Okay.
So this was recorded by Elvis March 28th, 1972. It was written by two songwriters by the names of James Last and Carl Sigmund, but not together. It was originally an instrumental written by James Last. James Last was a German composer and leader of the James Last Orchestra. He was also known as Hansi. He had a song that he had written called Happy Heart, that Andy Williams and Petula Clark had each separately released in 1969, and both had reached the top 20 on the Easy Listening chart. He had a substantial number of hit albums. Between 1967 and 1986, he had 52 hit albums on the UK charts, which put him in that country second behind only Elvis Presley for the number of charting records. However, he had received some criticism because it was very much easy listening, kind of middle-of-the-road type stuff. Some music critics called him the king of elevator music.
Wow.
And then the other songwriter who had done the lyrics, Carl Sigmund, was actually from Brooklyn, and he had gone to school to be a lawyer, but had been encouraged by his friend Johnny Mercer, who was a songwriter, to also become a songwriter. So he did. He actually became pretty famous for writing English lyrics to songs from foreign countries, stuff like What Now My Love was one that he had written lyrics to, which obviously Elvis was a fan of. He had written the lyrics for Answer Me My Love, which had been recorded by Nat King Cole and Roy Hamilton. He had done the not necessarily lyrics per se, but he had co-written Pennsylvania 65000 with Glenn Miller. And one of his original songs where he had written both the music and the lyrics was Ebb Tide, which had been recorded by Frank Chaxfield, the Righteous Brothers, and Roy Hamilton on Roy's record You'll Never Walk Alone.
At last, we're face to face, and as we kiss through an embrace, I can tell, I can feel you are there, you are real,
I don't know if you're a fan of the Fallout franchise at all, the video games.
Yeah, the video games. Yeah, I've played them a little bit.
So Carl Sigman had also written Civilization, the Bongo 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 I Don't Want to Leave the Congo song, which was recorded by Danny Kaye and the Andrews Sisters, and Crazy He Calls Me by Billie Holiday, which both of those songs were in the Fallout games. Just thought I'd mention that because I'm a fan of Fallout. But anyway, so... which I don't think we've talked about that on the show before, but in Fallout New Vegas, there are the Kings, which is kind of an interesting... Anyway, I'm getting way off track.
Do an Elvis video game episode sometime.
I should.
Any crossover.
I should totally do that. Unfortunately, there's actually very few.
Yeah, there's not a lot that I can think of, but...
Again, Melody was originally by James Last and released as an instrumental on his album just called Last in 1971, but it was under the title of No Words. And it's very interesting listening to it because it's a much more expressive instrumental. The piano does play the melody, but there's a different intro, a different outro, and there's an orchestral musical break in the middle. It's a little more melancholy. And it actually brings, when the melody comes back, when you listen to Elvis's version, the lyrics, make it, very sad, reflective, fool, you didn't have to lose her, hurt her, basically saying that the guy had screwed up a relationship. But musically, if you just listen to it, that's actually the more uplifting part of the song in the instrumental. When it was when Carl Sigman wrote the lyrics, he actually clipped out those other instrumental sections and then had it recorded originally by Wayne Newton in 1972. The way that the delivery is done in the Wayne Newton version and also in the instrumental of the melody of fool, you didn't have to hurt her, fool, you didn't have to lose her. It's very different from Elvis's, because Elvis, when you listen to it, he is on the beat. Fool, you didn't have to hurt her. Whereas in the originals, it's...
Fool, you didn't have to hurt her. Fool, you didn't have to lose her. Fool, you only had to love her. Now love is gone.
It's in between the beats, which it gives it a very different feel. Although it definitely shows that Elvis had a much more kind of traditional rock and roll or country style that he was bringing to it, because Elvis's version is almost a country rock version of it. His version was recorded at RCA Studio C in Hollywood, backed by the TCB band, James Burton, Charlie Hodge, Sean Wilkinson, Glenn Hardin, Emery Gordy, Ronnie Tutt, and J.D. Sumner and the Stamps were doing the backup vocals. When I listened to the Wayne Newton one, I didn't really think there was much in the way of backing vocals. but they are very noticeable on the Elvis version.
Fool, you didn't have to hurt her. Fool, you didn't have to lose her. Fool, you only had to love her. Now her love is gone.
Elvis's version was recorded in only 2 takes. The first take is a complete take. It's essentially the same, with the exception of the piano intro is a little different, and it's a little more similar to the Wayne Newton version as far as the opening, but the rest of it is, I mean, essentially much more rock-influenced, country rock. The bridge is much more dramatic.
Gone now, a love and laughter. See yourself the morning after. Can't you see her eyes all misty when she said goodbye?
It was released as a single with Steamroller Blues originally, and it reached number 15 in the UK, number 17 in the US, with and it was a double A-side with Steamroller Blues. And then it, of course, appeared on the album Elvis, which has later become known as the Fool album, because it was the first song on the A-side to kind of distinguish it from the 1956 album, also called Elvis. What are your kind of thoughts on Fool?
I think it would surprise a lot of people that the song charted in the top 20. It's it kind of goes against the narrative that after Aloha, nothing happened for Elvis in the 70s. I think if people leave out the songs that he had that charted through the 70s, whether it's that or Promised Land, and no, I think the first time I remember hearing this song was when I was getting back into Elvis, and I bought the Burning Love album that RCA put out in like 1999.
Yes, I love that album.
Yeah, because it's a reimagining of what an album maybe should have looked like around this time period versus what they actually put out. Mm-hmm. And that's the first time I remember hearing it. But
and that's an interesting story in and of itself, because at the time, those studio sessions, because Fool was also recorded at the same session as Burning Love, and so Elvis was much more in the mood for Fool and Always on My Mind and It's a Matter of Time than he was for Burning Love. But
right.
But it is interesting because there were studio sessions. Also on the in those sessions was Separate Ways, For the Good Times, and Where Do I Go From Here, all of which were supposed to appear on an album that was going to be called Standing Room Only, which never came to fruition. They ended up being released assorted as singles. Fool was kind of compiled from a mix of these and live performances. But later on, FTD did actually release Standing Room Only as a quote-unquote classic album, as a lost album, with alternate takes. It's very interesting to sit down and listen to it because the songs have a much more thematic cohesion to them. And Burning Love was kind of the commercial retail version of that in the early 2000s. That it was essentially kind of like what you said. It was what a proper studio album for like the 1972-1973 era would have or should have been. Much in the same way that Tomorrow is a Long Time was a nice compilation of the 1966 to 1968 kind of era, because there wasn't really a version of that compiled all those great kind of country rock songs like Guitar Man and U.S. Mail and Too Much Monkey Business. And of course, Tomorrow is a Long Time, the Bob Dylan song. Yeah, and that's one thing to your point about the top 20 songs. I think a lot of people just look at the number ones and forget that, I mean, Elvis had a lot of very memorable songs that didn't hit the top 20, and a lot of songs that have since been forgotten that reached either the top 20 or the top 40. I really think what would be great is I wish that Sony would put out a top 40 compilation for the US so that people could like see the scope of, because like all of the hits compilations that I've seen really only have touched on the biggest of the hits. without getting a lot of these more obscure ones like Fool and Steamroller Blues, which typically wouldn't appear on a lot of hits compilations, even though by, kind of traditional standards, that is a hit. I mean, a top 20 song is a hit song.
Yeah, I feel like they kind of were getting into that area with Second to None back in like 03 or whatever, but after 30 number one hits, and they never really expanded as much as they could have, like you're saying, like a top 40.
They had a weird 3-disc box set that came out after, because 30 number one hits came out, and then Second to None came out in 2003, and then in 2004, when all of the other stuff was coming, Elvis at Sun was coming out, the DVD box sets were coming out, and then they had what they called Hitstory. It was HITS History, and it had a third disc that was essentially what the third volume of the 30 number one hits Second to None series would have been, but it was only released on that box set, and I never saw it at retail. I never saw a copy of Hitstory. In fact, I don't even have it in my collection. I just have those first two CDs.
I remember seeing like one copy of it when I was working at Best Buy at the time, but we didn't get, like, we had a lot of 30 number one hits, and Second to None actually sold quite a few of them, but this one for some reason we did get box sets in. It wasn't like we didn't stock box sets, but that one was definitely more rare. Didn't see it around as much.
And the track list was pretty good as well, because I mean, it had I Beg of You, My Wish Came True, Ain't That Lovin' You Baby, Fame and Fortune, I've Got to Know, Flaming Star, Follow That Dream, One Broken Heart. I mean, just, again, going down all the way through Love Letter, Separate Ways, Steamroller Blues. I mean, this is kind of what I'm talking about, where it is more of the top 40 type stuff that were hits, but weren't the number ones or the top tens. And it's just a shame that never got the same sort of major push that those first two volumes did. God, I would really like to see a top 40 release here in the States. God. And
I think that would be great.
It's getting tough now, though, because I mean, so much has changed to streaming that yes, you do get box sets like A Boy from Tupelo or Elvis at Stax, but by and large, I mean, CDs are going away.
Mm-hmm. This is something they could do even on like a YouTube, Vimeo, that kind of thing, where they they could release like a series. Focus on those songs or something like that, just to kind of introduce them to people.
Yeah. That's one thing, too, when you were talking about that earlier, and I'm sorry I'm getting off track on my Song of the Week, but Gurdip and I had talked about Where No One Stands Alone, and that I appreciated that it was a lyric video. I really wish they would do more Elvis lyric videos, like professionally produced lyric videos.
Yeah.
Because obviously, I mean, there's some songs that they're just... They couldn't even bother with the rights issues with like the movies and getting permission from Paramount and from MGM and from all the companies that own all that footage. There's obviously rights issues, but I mean, you can still do lyric videos.
Mm-hmm.
And those are so popular now, and it's disappointing that they haven't figured that part out yet.
Yeah.
But as far as covers, again, Wayne Newton did a version of it originally, and then there was really only one other notable cover. There was an Israeli singer by the name of Dalia Lavi who had done a version of it, and it's okay. it's kind of the same arrangement as the Wayne Newton version rather than the Elvis version. It's okay.
You didn't have to hurt me, fool. You didn't have to lose me, fool. You only had to love me. Now love is gone.
By and large, it hasn't really had many covers, and I think in part because it's not as well known of an Elvis Presley song. Because it is much more in that 70s easy listening vein that he was going for in the mid to late 70s. So, yeah. And then where it kind of... the other cool thing was that originally there was supposed to be a string section. overdubbed onto it, and they had even recorded it, but it never got released until posthumously on the Elvis Aaron Presley silver box set in the 80s. It was released, and it's never been released since digitally.
Gone now, the love and laughter. See yourself the morning after. Can't you see her eyes are misty as she said goodbye?
So, yeah, it's out there. Folks can find it, but it's definitely... It's different. I like it, but I've said before that, like, I'm a sucker for strings, so I like the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra releases were just right up my alley because I was just like, oh, it touches all the right, feels for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so anyway, that was my song of the week, Fool. I thought it was worth bringing up because, again, it's one of those songs that people don't think of as a hit, but it kind of was. And I was listening to it in the car earlier today, and I tend to wait to the last minute to pick my songs of the week because I like to get that kind of last minute inspiration of like, this is what's hitting me right now. So yeah, it hit me today. It's good.
Definitely. Good choice.
Thank you. So, all right. Well, that I think is it for this week's episode of TCBcast. It's been fun.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, man. Thanks for having me on. I'd love to be back sometime.
So if people want to find you, where can they find you?
All right. So, again, the podcast is Top Rope Nation. And so it's a pro wrestling podcast. If you're at all interested in that industry, give it a listen. We talk in kind of like the backstage news and what's going on in the wrestling companies around the world. We review the latest shows, things like that. The writing's over at comicbook.com and popculture.com. And you can find me on Twitter at historicalryan. And yeah, that's where I'm at. So
Wonderful.
Check it out.
And your show is a very well reviewed show, by the way. I noticed you've got, a good sized following.
Yeah, we've been doing it for about 2 years now. We took a break around the time my daughter was born, and actually on the break was when a couple of my co-hosts' kids were born, and we've just been getting back into it.
Nice.
I think in February, and pretty much every week we put out a show. So
Great.
Yeah, thank you. It's growing. So I enjoy doing it, but it was also fun to come on here and talk about something a little bit different that I'm interested in. So
absolutely. Of course, you can find us TCBcast on Facebook, YouTube. We're on tcbcast.libsyn.com. Of course, Spotify, YouTube, all those fun things. If you want to write into us, tell us what you think of. Anything we talked about this week, our songs of the week. If you want to hear Ryan back on again, let us know. He was awesome. I know, again,
definitely.
Like I said, Gurdip's going to be jealous. He's going to wish that we could have you on again so that you guys can talk shop on wrestling.
And
Elvis. And Elvis.
I'll do it anytime if the public demand it. I'll be back.
Maybe even if not.
Yes.
So, all right. Well, I think that's it for the week. So it's a hot time in Florida.
Rainy night in Georgia.
Sweet.
You've been listening to the TCBcast, an unofficial Elvis fan podcast. Justin Gosman and Gurdip Ladar have left the building.
Someone must have stomped on his head with those blue suede shoes.
Thank you and good night.